Well, so good morning to all. And here we are once again, preparing to discuss a new subject. Last week, we concluded our discussion of Homer and the Odyssey, and even moved on to something that is, of course, related to the Odyssey, but not by Homer. I am, of course, referring to the imaginary epistle by Penelope to the tardy Ulysses in Ovid's collection of imaginary epistles called the Heroides, the epistles of heroines to their absent or unfaithful loved ones. We will return to Ovid later, and also to the letters of heroines. But today we are beginning our discussion of the second great ancient Greek poet, second, that is to Homer. And of course, I am referring to Hesiod, or as he is known in Greek, Hesiodos. Now, Hesiod, what I propose to do is to provide some general background about him. Where did he hail from? What did he write? The genre of his poems. And then, of course, we will discuss the passages that I have selected from one of his poems, The Works and Days. We will read and analyze it almost line by line. So we will begin with some general background about Hesiod. Now, Hesiod, there's more that is known about him than of Homer. Homer was a complete mystery, and we saw that his very historicity is in question, in doubt. Hesiod, however, provides us with details, with biographical details about himself in his works. We know, for instance, from the Theogony, that is the poem that describes the genealogy of the gods and the creation of the world, the universe. At the very beginning, he says that he was grazing his flocks on Mount Helicon in Greece. So we know, for instance, that he was a shepherd. We also know of his father, who emigrated, as it were, to mainland Greece from Ionia. So his father immigrated from Ionia to mainland Greece. We know that he had a brother whose name was Perses. We will see it written in a short time. Now, whether that brother was indeed a historical figure, we don't have any way to prove, but Hesiod speaks of him as to a real person. He addresses the Works and Days, that is the second major poem by Hesiod. He addresses it to his brother Perses. We will, of course, explain why he does so, but it is addressed to him, so we know that he had a brother. We also know the name of the village where he resided. It's called Askra. It's a village near Mount Helicon in Greece. So that constitutes a lot of details, considering that we are speaking of a person who lived at the time of Homer. There has been much discussion and deliberation and argument amongst scholars as to the exact date of Hesiod. There are those who date him to the 8th century, some even to the late 9th century. That is very close to Homer, if not actually contemporary with him. So the general consent these days is that Hesiod and Homer were contemporaneous. That is, they lived and worked at the same time. Whether they knew one another is really beyond our knowledge. There is a legendary tradition that there once was a so-called artistic battle between, or contest between Hesiod and Homer. It's called the Certamen Hesiodi et Homeri, that is the conflict or the battle between Hesiod and Homer. Of course, a poetic contest. It is, of course, fictitious, and there's no evidence that such a contest really took place. However, it is a nice speculation to imagine these two great poetic forces of the very beginning of the Greek world confronting one another and having, as it were, a trial of their poetic puissance, that is, power and talent. So Hesiod and Homer were contemporary. They create in the same genre, that is epic poetry. However, Homer's is heroic epic, that is the grand scale of battles and heroes and gods, as is well depicted in Iliad and Odyssey. Hesiod cultivated another kind of epic poetry, which is in scope much smaller than the heroic epic. And he composed what is known today as didactic poetry. Okay? Didactic poetry. I will write it for you, and you will be able to copy it. So he composed didactic poetry. Now, as the name suggests, okay, so just a second. First of all, Hesiod, we are speaking of the 8th century, of course, BC. There'll be no mistake. And contemporary of Homer. He composed didactic poetry, and as the name suggests, didactic poetry aims to instruct and educate us in a certain field. Both the theogony and the works and days, so these are the two didactic epic poems attributed unquestionably to Hesiod. The theogony, that is an epic poem that describes and enumerates the succession of gods and explains how they are related to the creation of all that we see around us, that is the world and the universe at large. The theogony, that's one, and works and days. Works and days, a literal translation of the Greek, which is primarily concerned with why we should work, why there is toil in the world, and the world being what it is, how is it that we should till the earth and grow crops and provide ourselves with food. It is, of course, agricultural in its general intent. Why? Because always remember that Hesiod was a shepherd. He was a man of the earth. He was living in a village where agriculture was everything. So it is only natural that he should write and compose an epic poem, a didactic epic poem, that is concerned with how to produce the most of your plot of land. And that is essentially what is described in the Works and Days. Of course, to make it much more interesting, he also speaks and mentions important myths that explain, in the first place, why it is that we should toil and work. How is it that we can know when and how to till the earth? Usually by looking at the stars and judging from them the precise time where it would be advisable, say, to reap the harvest and so on and so forth. So the didactic spirit of these works is evident because they aim to instruct, they aim to teach, and as I said, they are much shorter in scope than the great heroic epics of Homer. Just to give you an example, we know that the Iliad is roughly 16,000 lines of hexameter verse, whereas the Works and Days is more or less 700 lines of hexameter. We know that the Iliad is divided, has been divided to 24 books, and so has the Odyssey. Theogony and Works and Days are not divided into books. They're all in, as it were, one book. And all of Hesiod's extant and undisputed works are contained in this slim volume. So you can see that it does not compare with Homer. By the way, I can tell you the exact number of lines of, say, the Works and Days. These amount to 698 lines for the Works and Days, and the Theogony is slightly longer, 798. So both of them are equal in length to, say, one average book of the Iliad. But again, it's not so much the scope that matters as does the content. And Hesiod's importance is that he, in fact, established this, let's say, not exactly genre, but well, let us call it a genre of didactic poetry, because for the ancient Greeks, it was not so much distinct from heroic poetry. They were both epics because they defined their poetry. We spoke about that based on the meter in which it was composed. So if Homer's epics were composed in hexameters and Hesiod's were composed in hexameters as well, so they both essentially belonged to the same genre. We make the finer distinction of heroic epic and didactic epic or didactic poetry. Now, the most prominent proponent of this kind of epic is Hesiod. He was the first to have composed didactic poetry. This kind of poetry was later carried on by the first philosophers like Xenophanes or Parmenides, who also expressed their thoughts, their teachings in poetry. Later on, however, say in classical Athens of the 5th and 4th centuries, poetry lost its stature, its position as a means to convey instruction in specific fields, let us say philosophy, and yielded, as it were, to prose. Because we know that Plato expressed himself in prose, as did Aristotle and the other philosophers whose works did not really survive, but they wrote in prose. So it began as poetry. Poetry was the first means of expression of whatever it was that you wanted to express. A few centuries later, it yielded, as I said, it gave its place to prose, in which the great philosophical works were written. And there was a revival of didactic poetry, where? In Alexandria, in the Hellenistic period, Alexandria of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, of course, where in the famous and celebrated museum and library, where much science was done and expressed, some of it at least, in poetic form. Now, not much of it has survived. I can think of one very well-known work, which is called the Phenomena, rather the Phenomena, if you will, in English, the Phenomena by Arouetty. It's not really important to remember, but because it's not really part of our course, but Arouetty might be considered a far descendant of Hesiod in a long line that was broken somewhere along the way of didactic poets. And Arouetty wrote of the movements of the stars in heaven and the constellations, the rising and setting, and the importance of these phenomena. And it was a very popular work in ancient times. Cicero translated it into Latin. The translation did not survive intact, but the Greek original did. And so we have it, and we can read it. So it's didactic poetry. Now, we can also characterize at least the works and days also as what we would call wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is familiar to us usually in biblical contexts, say the book of Proverbs, for instance, is perhaps the most well-known example of wisdom literature, which has its origins in the East, the ancient East, which far precedes anything Greek in culture. It originated in Persia, in Babylon, and the line continued over into Greece. How exactly the connection was made is unknown, but there was some sort of cultural influence in that region, because we see, it is no secret, many common characteristics in these ancient tales and myths. One of them we will discuss, of course, today, that is the races of man, the ages of man. And I'll give you a nice parallel from the Bible. Not so much known, but still it's there. So it's also called wisdom literature, again, for the same reason, because it aims to make us wise, to instruct us and to show us what is right and, of course, what is wrong, and everything that we need to avoid if we want to lead a peaceful, meaningful, and happy life. Now, another interesting thing that perhaps you've asked yourselves, if Hesiod and Homer were contemporaneous and lived and worked at the same time, did Hesiod write his poems, or were they also part of the oral tradition? Well, it is generally agreed that they were part of the oral tradition. We have no way to ascertain, that is to say with any degree of certainty, that Hesiod knew writing. We know that at that time, the 8th century BC, writing began to evolve and become more sophisticated in ancient Greece, in Greece at large, but it was not yet ripe to serve as a means of poetic expression, at least not to the degree that we find in Hesiod and in Homer. You will see the same formulaic nature that we found in Homer in Hesiod as well. And it is generally agreed that he also recited his poems. Perhaps he dictated them to someone who was more, shall we say, adept or skilled in writing, or that they were also committed to memory and were put to writing a short time after his death. But he was part of the oral tradition. It becomes clearer that writing was the means of poetic composition without any doubt in the 6th century BC. And, sorry, not the 6th, maybe the mid-7th century BC. Then we have no doubt that writing was already sophisticated enough and common enough for poets to actually compose in writing. But before that, it is rather blurred, especially when we consider poets of, the 8th, and as some would have it, even the 9th century BC, Homer and Hesiod. So he belongs to the oral tradition, and he writes in the same dialect. That is the Homeric dialect, which we described and defined as an artificial dialect that was never a spoken language. It was a poetic language used especially for the oral composition of epics, be they heroic or didactic, it did not matter. But they were all composed in the Homeric dialect, of course, written in hexameters, hexameter verse, the same meter that was used in the Iliad and Odyssey. We find the same epithets that describe the heroes and the gods, especially Zeus. There are lines, repetitive lines, formulaic lines that are actually the same when you compare the Iliad and say Works and Days. So in both, Zeus is referred to as the counselor or the cloud gatherer, the father of gods and men. These are epithets that are common to Zeus in both Hesiod and Homer. Athena, for example, is called the bright-eyed Athena, Glaukopis Athene, which really means Athene with the eyes of an owl, but is generally taken to mean bright-eyed Athene. So the connection is clear and the tradition is clear, even though they lived in completely different parts of the Greek world. Now, the Greek world is something that, just a second, the Greek world is something that we need to perhaps better explain. Just a second. Yes. This is something we will return to later, but okay. So this is Boeotia, Boeotia, the region in Greece, in central Greece, where Hesiod lived. Askra is it's his village is somewhere over here, and this, in very fine print, is Mount Helicon, where the Muses reside, and where Hesiod tells us he was grazing his flocks when the Muses came down, and I can read the exact line. So the Muses came down, and what did they tell Hesiod? Well, you rough shepherds, wretched objects of reproach, nothing but bellies. We know how to speak many false things that look like the truth, and we know how, when we wish, to speak the truth. So spoke the eloquent daughters of great Zeus. They plucked and gave me a staff, the shoot of a blooming laurel, a thing of wonder, and they breathed into me a marvelous voice, so that I might celebrate what came before and what will come after. So as he was peacefully grazing his sheep near Mount Helicon, behold, the Muses come down and reprimand him, telling him that he and the other shepherds are nothing but bellies. That's the most material thing we can think of. You are just a belly. You're only concerned with food and drink. No, listen to us. We know many things, both true and false. So that they begin, by the way, by saying we can say many lies, but also, when we wish, to say the truth. So thereupon, they gave him a laurel staff. That is a mark of the poet. And ever since, he has been chanting the song of the Muses, of things that were, things that are, and things that will come to pass. So he had, as it were, an epiphany, a revelation, divine, of course, of the Muses that infused him. Again, common with Homer. The poet does not work independently of the Muses. He is infused with inspiration, with divine inspiration through the Muses. So this is Boeotia, and this is where Hesiod lived and worked. Homer, well, we can't even see that part of the Greek world where he worked, because it is across the sea. Imagine the map continues somewhere over there, and then you reach the shores of Ionia, where we imagine Homer worked. We spoke of the island of Chios in Ionia. That's the western part of modern Turkey. So you see that there's a real, tangible, physical gap between Hesiod and Homer. And yet the dialect, the poetic dialect, was common, which in turn can serve as proof that the profession of aoidoi, those oral poets who recited poetry and, as it were, improvised in every new recitation, was very common in that relatively wide region, so that the knowledge passed and the language, the artificial language of poetry, was known. Now, Hesiod, there you have him, a bit black and grim, maybe a bit clearer. Well, nobody knows if this is Hesiod, for the very simple reason that nothing of 8th century, or that there were no busts of poets in the 8th century BC, but this is a Roman bust, a Roman statue, really unrecognizable. It's called the Pseudo Seneca. There are those who believe it's a bust of Aristophanes, but some would take it as an image, a likeness of Hesiod. I don't know if you can see very clearly, but the expression is one of concern, worry, sorrow, perhaps even despair, I would say. And that is not contrary to what he expresses in the Works and Days, because he says human life is hard and we must toil, we must work, as well as experience difficulties, diseases, illnesses, really almost unbearable hardships from day to day. So no wonder he looks a bit grim, if indeed that is he. So we, in our discussion, will focus on the Works and Days. The Theogony is, as I said, the story of the creation of the world, the major gods and goddesses that operate within it and that create it as well. Of course, included in it are many famous myths. Perhaps the most famous one and the best known is the myth of Prometheus, which also, which also features in the Works and Days, and which we will discuss. Now, the Works and Days assumes a certain knowledge of the myth of Prometheus as is described in the Theogony, and we will mention it. Why do I choose to focus on the Works and Days? Well, because personally, I like the stories in it better. That's the only reason. Both are great poems. But my personal preference is the Works and Days. Just so that you know, there are only these two works, epic, didactic epic works, that are genuinely considered to be the work of Hesiod. There is another called the Shield of Heracles, which is the description of the Shield of Heracles, also in hexameter verse, that is attributed to Hesiod, but by general consent is thought to be spurious, that is not of his writing. Still, in modern edition of Hesiod, it is included under the name or under the authorship of Hesiod, but it is not. There were other works in antiquity attributed to him. Some are lost, some are known to be not of his creation. So basically, it comes down to these great epic, didactic epic poems, the Theogony and the Works and Days. Now, the main aim of the Works and Days is, as I said, to explain, to give reason why life is hard. And that is called, just a second, that is called etiology. Now, etiology is the attempt to find causes to things. Why are things as they are? This has been on humanity's collective mind since time immemorial. It is, I would say, what makes us distinctively human. We are curious and we cannot bear not to know. So much so that even we resort to imaginative invention when we do not know the real cause. This, of course, is nowhere better expressed than in myths. We do not know why ships vanish in calm waters. Why, of course, there were sea monsters who rose from the deep and dragged the unsuspecting mariners to the bottom of the sea. No one would surmise, let's say, a much simpler reason, such as a leak in the wooden frame of the ship that caused it to sink. Imaginative tales arise everywhere, and it is part and parcel of nearly the mythology of any culture. You just think about a culture and you'll find many imaginative myths and tales, and they are all part of etiology. And etiological stories or etiological myths are indeed a very specific kind of myths in what we call Greek mythology. We can characterize the different myths according to what it is that they aim to convey. For instance, there are the heroic myths, tales of Achilles and Odysseus, and Theseus, and the Argonauts, and many others. There are etiological stories, such as those of Hesiod in the Works and Days, where he explains why life is hard. There are also initiation myths, where we can trace the gradual development of the heroic figure from, let's say, everyday regularity into the heights of heroism. So that also is a kind of myth initiation. But we are concerned with etiology here. And as I said, people want to know why. It is said of the philosopher Democritus of Abdera, one of the first proponents of the atomic theory, that he said, "I would rather understand one cause than be king of Persia." So much so was it important to him to understand, much more than, to accumulate worldly riches. To understand one cause fully was better than to preside over empires. Well, so in the Works and Days, Hesiod speaks of two kinds of strife. Okay? Strife, strife in Greek, it is eris. Conflict, dispute. And he claims that there is good strife and there is, of course, bad strife. We intuitively almost tend to associate strife with ill and evil intentions. However, says Hesiod, there is another kind of strife, the good kind of strife, which is that encourages contest and emulation and competition in peaceful times. Say, a person sees his neighbor's fields blooming and yielding good crops. This creates within him the sense of emulation. Why? I would like my fields to be as fruitful and fertile. So he goes out and labors and works and puts great effort into his own plot of land so as to achieve comparable results to those of his neighbor, and even, if he can, surpass him. And so you see the good kind of strife that is connected with ambition, the will to advance and make progress. So there are two kinds of strife, and he wishes to encourage his brother Perses to adopt the second, that is the good kind of strife, or rather the first kind of strife. The second, of course, being the evil kind, strife that is connected with war, with combat, with trying to achieve results by fraudulent means. For instance, I see my neighbor's field flourishing and producing fine crops. Why? I will enlist an army and conquer his territory and take hold of his possessions. That is also strife, but it is the bad kind of strife, which should be avoided because it is against the rules of justice. That is dike in Greek, dike, justice, which is of course under the auspices of all-powerful Zeus. So the bad kind, the evil kind of strife is that. Those who try to achieve things by force, by violence, the Greek would be hubris in this case, by violence, by fraudulent means. And this is where the story, the kinds of strife are made relevant to his brother Perses. The whole reason for composing the Works and Days, we said, was didactic, but it was personally didactic because Hesiod wanted to educate his brother Perses. There was strife and contention between the brothers over what? Over their patrimony. Now, patrimony are in fact the assets, the possessions bequeathed them by their father who died. So they were not poor. They had land of their own that was passed on to them as inheritance by their father, and that is called patrimony. Now, Perses, so we are made to understand, used his connections with say, powerful figures in the village of Askra to defraud Hesiod, to take more than his due share of their patrimony. And that, of course, created strife and conflict between the brothers. So Hesiod aims to prove to Perses, his brother, that strife is not, that evil strife is not what is required here. And he tells him, this would be a good time to move into the text itself. He tells him, you do not understand how much more the half is than the whole. How much more the half is than the whole. What does he mean by that? Nor how great the boon is in mallow and asphodel. Now, mallow and asphodel are names of herbs, simple herbs, usually the food of the poor. And Hesiod tells his brother that the half is more than the whole. He means by that even if you have a small portion, you don't have everything, you have half of the whole, but you gained it justly. You did not use fraudulent means to come by your possessions. It is better to have half, justly won, than to have the whole fraudulently gained. That is a very nice lesson. Now, this leads Hesiod into describing why, to begin with, do we have to toil and to labor and to earn our living, of course, justly and not by fraudulent means. So now he wants to educate his brother Perses. And again, I say, we do not know if Perses was really his brother, if there was such a person, or maybe it's just a figment of it's a brother of Hesiod's imagination, created for the purposes of the composition of the works and days. We don't know, nor does it matter. Let us, for the purposes of, convenience, assume that Perses was a real figure, a real brother to Hesiod, and that there was conflict over patrimony between them. And as a result, Hesiod composed this poem to educate his brother and, in fact, make him a better person. Now, before we begin reading the passages that I have selected, we will say two things. First of all, there are three distinct stories here. One which is very short, the story of Prometheus, then the story of Pandora, closely related to that of Prometheus, and then the stories of the ages of man. The purpose of all of which is to explain the hardships of modern life. And modern, in our case, is 8th century BC Boeotia. You will see that in many respects, 8th century BC Boeotia resembles 21st century, Western Hemisphere. Or let us take the whole globe in its entirety. You'll see that we will find many ills still among us. So again, do not expect too much encouragement from these stories. They are not meant to encourage, they are meant to show why things are as they are. Etiology, the causes. Now the translation that I have selected, if you've looked at it, you would have seen that part of it is in Greek. See, the left side of the page is in Greek. That's the original. And facing it on the right is the English translation. Now, anyone who is even slightly familiar with classical texts would know that this is taken from the celebrated editions of the Loeb Classical Library. The Loeb Classical Library has been in existence for more than a century, and they have published, along that long period of time, nearly everything that is Greek and Latin in small hardback volumes that give you a reliable text of the original and a translation that is, in most cases, faithful and accurate. All the more so in the recent volumes that they have published, of which this is one. This was published quite recently in 2018. It is a translation by a great scholar named Glenn W. Most. He is, by the way, one of the co-editors of one of the books that I recommended in the bibliography, The Classical Tradition. So he's one of the editor of that encyclopedic, I would say, work. But he is a great scholar of Greek and Latin. He even visited this university not so long ago. It was in 2013 13, where he held the keynote address lecture right above us on the 4th floor. It was about Diogenes Laertius and the sources of that biographer of philosophy. Anyway, a great scholar who produced a great modern translation of the entire works of Hesiod, including fragmentary works, that is, works that did not survive intact, but that are under what we would call the works attributed to Hesiod. There was a previous Loeb Classical Library edition made many decades ago, which is equally good, but, you know, as time passes, translation conventions tend to change. For some reason, the language changes. What was good for generation A is not so good for generation B. And so we have this relatively new translation, which is excellent and accurate. And that is why I chose to bring it before you. So we begin with an explanation. For the gods keep the means of life concealed from human beings. So it is no longer the case that we can go outside and just pick up our livelihood. Otherwise, if this were not the case, you would easily be able to work in just one day so as to have enough for a whole year, even without working. Imagine that. Only one day of work a year, and you would have sufficient supplies for the rest of the year. And quickly, you would store the rudder above the smoke. Now, what does he mean by saying you would store the rudder above the smoke? Well, to convey goods in the ancient Greek world, you would most commonly use ships. But if you had to work just one day a year, you would do your rounds on that day, and then you would take the rudder, that is the instrument you use to steer the ship, and you would hang it to dry above the hearth in your hut, in your home. And the work of the cattle and of the hard-working mules would be ended. How great would that be? What bliss would come upon us? How much leisure time we would then have. But this is not the case. But Zeus concealed it, angry in his heart, because crooked-counseled Prometheus, forethought, had deceived him. So one of the reasons that there is toil in the world is because of the anger of Zeus at having been deceived by Prometheus. Now, Prometheus is a name with meaning. You will see that many names here have meaning. Prometheus means forethought. And to present it in a negative light, he calls him crooked-counseled Prometheus. This is Prometheus Anculometes, which is an epic epithet, also found in Homer, but there attributed not to Prometheus, but to Kronos. Kronos of the crooked counsels. Here, Prometheus of the crooked counsels. Now, of course, crooked counsels because he deceived Zeus. And therefore, Zeus devised baneful evils for human beings. And he concealed fire. But the good son of Iapetus stole it back from the counselor Zeus in a hollow fennel stalk for human beings, escaping the notice of Zeus, who delights in the thunderbolt. So we have in this very short paragraph a description of what was a quite complex story of deception. It began with Prometheus deceiving Zeus in sacrifice. There was a sacrifice held in honor of the gods in a place called Mekone. That's written in the Theogony. And Prometheus made it so that the better portion of the sacrifice was given to people and not to the gods headed by Zeus. For that reason, what did Zeus do? He concealed fire from human beings. Now, fire is the emblem of all that is good in technology. All knowledge, all wisdom, all craft, all modern or ancient convenience that is yielded from human inventions are related to fire. Fire exemplifies all that. And in punishment for that deception, for that, let's say, disrespect to the gods, Zeus concealed fire from human beings. But Prometheus, who in this case is characterized as the trickster, the one who knows, perhaps the, let's say, the divine counterpart of Odysseus. So Prometheus the trickster stole it back from the counselor Zeus. Now, he's not called Prometheus the trickster here. I am calling him that. He is called as the good son of Iapetus. Iapetus was one of the Titans, father of Prometheus, who himself was also a Titan. That is the generation of gods that preceded the younger gods, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and the rest of the entourage. So the good son of Iapetus stole fire back from Zeus. You know, the famous description that he hid the fire in a fennel stalk for human beings, escaping the notice of Zeus, who delights in the thunderbolt. So again, this epithet of Zeus who delights in the thunderbolt is Homeric and epic. Yes. So again, this rouses the anger of Zeus, right? Because there has to be a retribution for that. Now we know the punishment that was dealt Prometheus. He was forcibly, violently, cruelly chained to a rock at the ends of the earth, at that time believed to be the Caucasus mountain range. So it is there that he is chained to a rock by Hephaestus, and Zeus's eagle, vulture, attends him daily to feed on his liver, which at night heals only to be eaten again the next day. Horrible punishment, well described in Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus, the play by Aeschylus. So that's punishment for Prometheus, not mentioned here. Here we want to see what punishment was devised to us, humans. Now you will see that what Hesiod writes is very omissive of details which we would consider important. For instance, it can more or less be gathered that there are no women amongst men at that time. Why? Because we are now going to read of the creation. It doesn't say so exactly that it is the first woman, but we are made to understand that she is, because it is a creation that was unknown till that time. So in many respects, Pandora is thought of as the first woman. And you can, of course, find parallels to that, to this story, that the creation of woman in a way leads to a certain, there's no better way to say it, disaster in the world, and there is a degeneration of morals in the universe, and we are punished for it. Or that the woman is in one way or another connected with ills and troubles. So this is no exception. As a revenge, Zeus decides to do the following. So the cloud gatherer Zeus spoke to him in anger. This is a formulaic line. And what does he say? Son of Iapetus, you who know counsels beyond all others, you are pleased that you have stolen fire and beguiled my mind. A great grief for yourself, we know why, and for men to come. And now he's being enigmatic. To them I shall give in exchange for fire an evil in which they may all take pleasure in their spirit, embracing their own evil. So it's going to be something that ostensibly is very good and desirable, but in embracing it, we embrace our own ruin. So he spoke, and he laughed out loud, the father of men and of gods. So it's a very dramatic scene. The Greek is hos efat ek degelasse pater andron de theonte. So he spoke and he laughed out loud, the father of men and of gods. And now we are going to read of the creation of woman. Now, this is going to be done and accomplished by several deities. First of all, the great craftsman Hephaestus is ordered to mix earth with water. So again, you can see that the man, well, woman, doesn't matter, is created from the earth. A mixture of earth and water as quickly as possible. And to put the voice and strength of a human into it. And to make a beautiful, lovely form of a maiden, similar in her face to the deathless goddesses, to the immortal goddesses. So Hephaestus is responsible for the figure and the voice and the attractiveness, the bodily attractiveness of whatever it is that is going to be created. Now, Athena is supposed to teach her crafts, to weave richly worked cloth. So she's going to be not only beautiful, but skilled in weaving, which is considered a great merit. And one of the key characteristics is to be provided by golden Aphrodite. So we have Hephaestus, Athena, now Aphrodite, to shed grace and painful desire and limb-devouring cares around her head. Okay, so now the translation is accurate and wonderful, but when you read it in the Greek, the sound of it is much more exotic and evocative of strange occurrences. It sounds something like this: Kai charin amphicheai kephalech usen Aphroditen. And this is the nice line. Kai pothon argaleon, kai gui oborus meledonas. So gui oborus meledonas, that is limb-devouring cares. And cares in the sense of desire, of lust, of passion, that you would look upon her and you would be filled with limb-devouring cares. You will not be able to resist the physical temptation of the maiden that is about to be created. And on top of that, the final deity that gets orders from Zeus is Hermes, the intermediary, the killer of Argus, to put a dog's mind and a thievish character into her. So it's going to be difficult to resist whatever is going to be created. And these are the injunctions of Zeus. So he orders, and we move on to the execution of these orders. And it is more or less parallel to what we've just read, with some slight variations, which is nice to notice. Now, instead of saying Hephaestus, he refers to him as the famous lame one, because we all know that Hephaestus was lame. He was crippled in his feet, so he's also called the famous lame one. And then we have bright-eyed Athena, who does as Zeus ordered. But then we do not have any mention of Aphrodite, because golden Aphrodite was supposed to shed grace and painful desire and limb-devouring cares around her head. Where is she? Well, the attendants of Aphrodite are usually the graces, the charites, charitai in the plural, and queenly persuasion placed golden jewelry all around her body, and the seasons. Now, pay attention to this. Persuasion with a capital P, and the seasons with a capital S. Now, this is something that is very, very characteristic of, just a second, of ancient Greek poetry. And we are speaking about abstract deities or powers, or personified abstract terms. For instance, we speak of persuasion, that is the ability to persuade. Persuasion is looked upon as a goddess, peitho in Greek. It is, to all purposes, a veritable goddess. It exists as an entity. We recognize it as an abstract noun, persuasion, but no, we should understand that we're speaking of an age that is very, the word is numinous. Numinous. Numinous means, roughly, filled with supernatural divine powers. The ancient world is, or was, much more numinous than our modern world, even though our modern world still has many numinous characteristics to it, esoteric beliefs and persuasions of one kind or another. But today, none of us would imagine persuasion as a goddess. The ancients did. Or shame, eidos in Greek. Just retribution, nemesis. These are abstract concepts that are given a more or less tangible physical form as gods and goddesses. And these are called abstract deities or powers or personified abstract terms. And so we find here persuasion. as though it were a goddess. Persuasion, queenly persuasion, placed golden jewelry all around her body and so on and so forth. And the messenger of the gods placed a voice in her, that is Hermes. The messenger of the gods placed a voice in her and named this woman Pandora. A meaningful name, or gift. Since all those who have their mansions on Olympus had given her a gift, because you saw that it was a joint effort of several deities to create Pandora. That is why she is called All Gift, a gift from all, a gift, a Greek gift to its true meaning, from all the gods and goddesses. And let us have no doubt, a woe for men who live on bread. And again, who are men who live on bread is an epic epithet. It would have sufficed to say just men. No, men who live on bread. And of course, who is it who will be the innocent recipient of Pandora? Well, none other than Prometheus's brother Epimetheus, the opposite of Prometheus, that is afterthought, the one who understands only after the wrong has been done. This is the root of all tragedy. And so, afterthought, you can see. The messenger of the gods was instructed to take her as a gift to Epimetheus, afterthought. And Epimetheus did not consider that Prometheus had told him never to accept a gift from Olympian Zeus, but to send it back again. So he was forewarned, do not receive any gift from Zeus. Well, he is Epimetheus. He cannot but receive the gift. And thereupon, the maiden Pandora opens her jar. Now we are made aware that she was also equipped with a jar, not a box or a chest, as is commonly thought, but a jar, a pithos, so a big jar, like a jar of wine, filled with ills and hardships and troubles and disasters and all the nasty things you can think of. And of course, she opens the lid and all these ills and atrocities pervade the world, except the personified goddess Hope, which here Glenn most translate as anticipation. The Greek word is elpis, which is commonly translated as hope. Now, it might sound strange if hope did not escape. How is it that we have it? Well, because we do not know for certain if things are going to turn out this way or the other. Hope is there, but it is hidden inside the jar. So we experience hardships and difficulties and setbacks all the time, but most of us at least still hope for the better. And why? Because we cannot really tell how things will turn out. We hope that it will be good. So, countless other miseries roam among mankind, for the earth is full of evils and the sea is full, and some sicknesses come upon men by day and others by night, of their own accord, bearing evils to mortals in silence, since the counselor Zeus took their voice away. Thus, what is the conclusion? It is not possible in any way to evade the mind of Zeus. So Prometheus tried to trick him, to deceive him, and as a result, we have today what we have. So this is one etiological myth that explains the cause of present-day ills and hardships. And now, completely disconnected, is another myth, a myth widely celebrated and used by other poets as well, later than Hesiod, the myth of the 5 ages of man, or the 5 races of man, which again tries to explain how we have come down from a sort of paradisiacal way of life, that is life in paradise, into modern day hardship. We find it in the book of Genesis. There is an explanation there how we have lost that paradisiacal existence and have come to live a life of labor and so on and so forth. We have the story of Pandora, which we've just read, and to conclude, we have the story of the 5 races of man. Here we have a mixture of traditions. Again, it is not an originally Greek myth. It was also found in ancient Eastern mythology, and it embodies, in a sense, what we call, there's a French expression called fin du siècle, which is the end of the century. We experienced it at the turn of the millennium. You will surely remember when there was great fear. What will happen come the new millennium, the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium? A sense that everything has already been done, that what is to come is going to be terrible, that surely the good old days of the past were much better than the ills of the present. And all in all, that our fathers and forefathers led a better, more just way of life, a more innocent and pure way of life. It is something that characterizes usually the end of periods, and finds its most prominent expression in the fin du siècle. It's a common okay, so this is what we have here. Again, an explanation of how we have degenerated. And the generations of man are compared to metals. So we are speaking, in fact, of metallic, as it were, metallic races. The first, of course, being the race of gold. There's an introduction. He addresses, by the way, his brother Perseus. If you wish, I shall recapitulate another story correctly and skillfully, and you lay it up in your spirit, how the gods and mortal human beings came about from the same origin. So the first generation, created, by the way, by the Titans, not by Zeus and the younger Olympian gods, but by the Titans. Golden was the race of speech-endowed human beings, which the immortals, in this case, as I said, the Titans, who have their mansions on Olympus, made first of all. They lived at the time of Kronos, when he was king in the sky. Just like the gods, they spent their lives with a spirit free from care, entirely apart from toil and distress. It is paradisiacal existence. No toil, no distress. Worthless old age did not oppress them. this eternal youth. But they were always the same in their feet and hands, and delighted in festivities, lacking in all evils. And they died, mark you, the essential difference between the gods and humans at that golden age was that the gods are immortal, whereas men, human beings, are mortal. But other than that, I can see no difference in their existence. It's carefree, there's no need to toil, there's no distress, there's no old age. They had all good things. The grain-giving field bore crops of its own accord. Imagine that. You'd only go outside and pick up a loaf of freshly baked bread, all made by the good grain-giving earth. And of course, they shared out, where is it? Yes, much and unstinting, and they themselves willing, mild-mannered, shared out the fruits of their labors, together with many good things, wealthy in sheep, dear to the blessed God. So there was sharing and a sense of commonwealth, as it were. No mention of conflicts of any kind, no wars, no violence. Everything was as in paradise. But all good things must come to an end, and so did the Golden Age. Why, we are not told, but gradually, one by one, they perished, and they have been promoted to watchers over judgments and cruel deeds, clad in invisibility, walking everywhere upon the earth. So they are still among us as spirits, we would say guardian angels, as it were, givers of wealth, and this kingly honor they received. But then, lo and behold, there is a degradation, a degeneration in the cosmos. Afterwards, those who have their mansions on Olympus made a second race, but this time, it is not the Titans who create them, but the younger Olympian gods headed by Zeus. How do we know that? Because we see later on in the paragraph that discusses the Silver Age that Zeus was angered by them and punished them. And the first degeneration of the world came about not because of people, by the way, but because of the gods. We know that the first generation of the Titans, ruled by Kronos, had a great conflict with the younger gods, the so-called true Olympian gods headed by Zeus, which is called the War of the Titans and the Gods, the Titanomachia. And this strife, the first godly divine war in the history of the mythological world, this was emblematic of a degeneration, a moral degeneration in the world. So all the degeneration, the metallic degeneration, is in fact symbolic of moral degeneration in the world. The first of such degenerations was instigated by the gods, not by people. The war between the Titans and their offspring, the would-be Olympians, made the world a worse place. And then the implication on humanity was that the generation then created was a generation of silver that had very curious characteristics, such as a boy would be nurtured for 100 years at the sight of his cherished mother, playing in his own house, a great fool. So it's a long period of childhood. But when they reached adolescence and arrived at the full measure of puberty, they would live for a short time only, suffering pains, something that did not exist during the Golden Age, because of their acts of folly. So we now have a silver generation that spends its life, most of its life in the house of its parents, only to live a short life as an adult, and also to be accused of acts of folly that lead to pain. For they could not restrain themselves from wicked outrage against each other. So there's no longer that sense of commonwealth and of sharing and of goodwill. But there is wicked outrage. It's not yet, mind you, not yet open war and murder or anything of the sort, but still a sense of hostility towards your fellow men. And what is much worse, and what caused the anger of Zeus, is this: nor were they willing to honor the immortals or to sacrifice upon the holy altars of the blessed ones, as is established right for human beings in each community. So they already committed the first, as it were, religious transgression, not sacrificing to the gods. And that is not looked upon with a kind eye by the gods. Then Zeus, Cronos' son, concealed these in anger, because they did not give honors to the blessed gods who dwell on Olympus. So this is how the Silver Age comes to an end. It is destroyed by Zeus, but as it was not yet all wicked, and also the measure of its wickedness was not what would still come to pass in future generations, they too were given honor. But since the earth covered up this race too, they are called blessed mortals under the earth. In second place, that is in second place to the golden generation, who are guardian angels on the earth. These have been relegated to under the earth in second place, but all the same, honor attends upon these as well. So these are guardian spirits under the earth, whatever that means. If we should go one day under the earth, perhaps we will know, but they are given sway over that region. And of course, the story of the generations continues in its degeneration, deterioration, degradation of morality. We've had gold, we've had silver, and now, of course, we come to bronze. And with that, we will end, at least for today. So Zeus the father made another race of speech-endowed human beings. And again, you see that the golden race was created by the Titans, and all the rest by Zeus and the Olympians. So Zeus, if you had any doubt, the creator now is Zeus, made another race of speech-endowed human beings, a third one of bronze, not similar to the silver one at all, out of ash trees. Terrible and strong they were, and they cared only for the painful works of Ares and for acts of violence. So now, if we've waited in anticipation long enough, we have war in the world. War has come to take place amongst human beings, and it is the clear mark of the Bronze Age. They were terrible, and they only cared for painful works, the painful works of Ares, which of course is a poetic way of saying war. and for acts of violence. They did not eat bread. So if they did not eat bread, they were probably eaters of meat because they had to sustain themselves on something. Okay. So I had thought that we would finish the story of the generations today, but we didn't. So we will carry this on to our next session. And then, of course, according to the syllabus, we will move on to the story of the creation of the world itself. That is bound to be very interesting. So take care, and I'll see you next week.